Support for Connecticut East this week comes from SCAD, the Southeastern Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, is offering a $3,500 sign-on bonus for licensed clinicians. Go to licensedclinicians.org to learn more. That's licensedclinicians.org. And Connecticut Council on Problem Gambling, here to help individuals and families affected by gambling-related harm. Call 1-888-789-7777 or visit our website at ccpg.org. Connecticut has 119,000 at-risk youth in the state, and something needs to be done. The 119K Commission was set up, has released their report, but what happens now? We find out. Plus, we take a look at other stories making the headlines from around the region. This is Connecticut East This Week. Hello, I'm Brian Scott Smith. In October 2023, an organization called Dalio Education released a report called Connecticut's Unspoken Crisis, showing that in 2022, there were 119,000 young people in the state at risk of being disconnected from education, family, and even jobs, laying out in stark terms the depth of what it called a crisis. Very quickly, organizations in Connecticut began to mobilize, and by March of 2024, the 119K Commission was formed by the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, who together with their various commissioners from all over the state spearheaded public meetings and discussions with those affected and with those who could make a difference, with the intent of creating a report before the year was out to present to the state. In October 2024, they did just that. So, although it's only been 2 months since the report was published, what happens now? I'm joined by Joe DeLong, Executive Director and CEO of the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, for an update. Joe, ever so many thanks for joining us.
Brian, thanks so much for having me.
So we're talking about today the 119K Commission, which, and we'll explain all of this as we go through the interview, is disbanded, but that sounds a bit of a strong word. But what it is, it's just moved on. It's the next evolution because the commission was there to do a job. They've done their job very well. A report has come out 2 months ago, and that's what we'll be talking about as well. And it's now being referred to as Young People First, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Talk to us about how we got here. This was started by the Dalio Foundation. How did that happen?
I think it was back in October of 2023, actually, that Dalio had released its report on the at-risk and disconnected youth. And I was a little taken back by the number, 119,000. I said, boy, that's massive. That's not a problem. That's a crisis. But what I was more struck by was when I reached out to our membership, our mayors and town managers and all of our municipal officials across the state. And I asked that simple question of, does this surprise you? And all of them said no. Said, we see it. We see how bad it's getting. We're dealing with it within our communities, and it's a challenge and it's sad. And so what we did initially at CCM is we set up a series of community conversations, brought in various stakeholders, people from the education communities, the nonprofit communities, just residents of the various communities across the state. And we set up roundtable discussions all over the state just to learn more and to lean in and find out what we could do. And it was interesting because at those discussions, we would get asked the question several times of what's next? What are you doing next? And our answer was, we don't know. Like we were just trying to lean into this space and learn. And it's so important and vital to our communities that we address it. But as an organization, we were trying to figure out how. And after having all of those community conversations, having discussions with our membership, we ultimately launched that 119K Commission, named after those 119,000 at-risk and disconnected young people, and went into this very long, very transparent, very open process of listening to stakeholders, listening to over 280 of these kids across the state of what their challenges were, listening to educators, that ultimately at the end resulted in that Young People First report with 22 aligned actions for addressing this population that the commission was able to release almost a year to the day of when Dalio released its report.
Talk to us about why CCM got involved in this.
We get involved in are things that impact our communities, right? And communities are a lot of things. Sometimes people look at CCM and they'll say they're the business side of a business labor relationship, or they're this or they're that. We're none of those things. We are what communities need us to be, what our municipal officials and municipal CEOs ask us to be. When we train newly elected officials who come in, what I always tell them is think of us as an extension of your staff. Our towns and cities are very small in Connecticut. They're very resource limited. And so what we're able to do is we're able to step in and do with the collective what the individual cannot do alone. But we do it under their direction and guidance. It's really based off of the needs of our towns and cities. It's what the mayors, the town managers, what the municipal CEOs come to us and say, here's an area where we could really use your help and support. And we have the capacity then to do a lot of data, a lot of research, a lot of state and federal advocacy on their issues, and a great deal of training and workshops on best practices, that sort of thing. But even with our team, I tell them all the time, our job description is simply what they need us to be. That's what we have to do. We have to adjust and adapt. And this is a major issue for every city and town. That's what's unique about this. People, it's not just an urban issue. People might look at it and say, oh, this is an urban issue. It's not just an urban issue. When you look at the Dalio report, this is a challenge that every town and city in Connecticut is dealing with. So it was a great space for us to step in and see if we could help.
You said earlier in the interview that when you saw the original Connecticut's Unspoken Crisis report from the Dalio Education and went out to your members and they said, yeah, we knew about that. How easy was it to then get them to sign up and say, hey, you may know about it, so now I want you to be part of the
Yeah.
solution in helping us find these answers?
Creating the appropriate infrastructure of the commission is the hard part. Getting the members to lean in and be a part of it and to engage was not difficult at all. They were enthusiastic because they know that this is a challenge that their communities face. But we went through several iterations of how to actually form the commission, what the commission should look like. And I have to be honest, my initial thought was I wanted to create this very large, big tent or umbrella commission that everybody who worked in this space had a seat. And what I think my members came to the conclusion of, and they were right as we had these different conversations, was that people would come in and fight for their territory. I'm here representing this segment, and I want to make sure that my segment gets a lot of attention and gets the funding and all of that. So we decided to set up a commission that was predominantly driven by the CEOs that then brought all of those various stakeholders in and listened to them. So nobody was really fighting for their territory, but was just able to educate the commission, and the commission was able to learn from them. And in addition to the CEOs, we really only had, well, actually three non-CEO members. I was non-municipal CEO members. I was one of them as the association head. And then we had Andrew Ferguson. We invited him to be a part of it as the Dalio Education co-CEO because he has so much vast knowledge and educational issues. And then a guy by the name of Josh Brown, who works with young people, but was this population. Josh spent 15 years of his life homeless, went through many challenges, and now he works with the very young people who are of the demographic that he was for much of his life. He's an inspirational story. And we really not only wanted Josh for his story, because that was his life experiences were important, but we also wanted Josh because Josh could take us to these populations. I don't necessarily know how to go out and meet with disconnected young people without somebody to take me there and to get them to trust and to listen. And Josh played a very vital role in getting the commission members to these young people and getting these young people to actually open up, trust us, and share their stories.
Over the course, obviously, of a year of the 119K commission, there was a lot of meetings. It was a huge effort. And obviously, for something to last for an entire year and then come up with a 100, I believe it's about 120-page report at the end of it is phenomenal. How did you feel as it continued to progress? Did you feel that this was going to be something massive at the end?
That's a great question because I felt the same way then as I feel sitting here today. Like I always wanted to do more. As big as this report is, and it's a lot to digest, There's areas at the beginning of this that I would have liked to have got into that I thought we would get into. And ultimately we just didn't because of capacity. The scope of this issue is massive. And so that was the biggest challenge, I think, throughout the process of developing the report was controlling scope and understanding that there were things that probably should be in there or could be in there that we just didn't have the time or the resources this go around to really tackle. But I don't believe for a minute that it's this report, go through these 22 aligned actions, we wash our hands and we walk away. There's work to implement these aligned actions, but there's work to be done beyond them as well. And so I'm not sure what that looks like or how we get there at this point, but I am pretty well convinced that we're just getting started.
Apart from the 22 aligned actions in the report as well, there were four strategic pillars: coordination, conditions, coalitions, and capacity. Coalition, it is something that we need to do more of. We've got so many good nonprofits and other organizations in the state, and often it does feel like they're working in silos, not necessarily deliberately, but because that's their organization's particular mission. And there is crossover, and therefore sometimes maybe a waste of dollars because, too many people are trying to do maybe the same thing when if they could actually come together, they're probably going to be more efficient. Is that fair?
Oh, I think that's one of the most important parts of this report. At the very beginning of this report, talk about building out the network of services, which that closes the gaps. When you take all of these different fragmented services and you put them under an umbrella where you can build out the network, you can see where the gaps are in the network. You can see where there's too much capacity. You can see where there's not enough capacity. It's so vitally important. And it's vitally important because these young people move through the system. So, and by moving through the system, that may mean they move across town. So right now, with our very fragmented 169 city and town system, we may offer a great set of services to a person that's in New Haven, but then that person moves to West Haven and they're lost because the system's not designed to pick them up. So that's very important to make sure that we build out that network to where we close those gaps. The other part is about how do young people get into the network to begin with? How do they access that first service that allows us to identify them? Right now, predominantly, they use a 211 system that was built in 1976 and really has never been updated. That the United Way, boy, they're doing yeoman's work. They're doing the best they can with limited resources and everything else. But that system is really behind the times. It's not the most ideal way for a young person to reach out for services. And then if you can get them to reach out for help or services through that system, their calls might get dropped. There can be long wait times. They can get through the long wait times and find out there's no service available, or they can get referred to a place for a service. And then when they call that place or they get connected to them, they're told that there's a wait list that's this long. So that is so important, number one, and the delivery side of getting people the help and the support that they need to keep them on track. But it's also very important, I think, as you mentioned, Brian, on the fiscally responsible side. So we are funding a network that works instead of funding a series of good ideas that maybe aren't really getting the job done. And so for the state, when you look at those who want to be fiscally responsible, fiscally conservative, cautious about state resources, building out that network is actually one of the best things that they could do, because then you would no longer have all of these people coming to the state house trying to see who had the greatest representation to get them 100,000 here or 200,000 there. You would have a network that works and you would fund the network, and then that money would funnel down through those services where we got real return on the investment. So I think that is one of the most critical components of this report, is really found within those two aligned actions.
Now, we need to be clear that this report is a recommendation. It has no statutory powers. It's a case of you've created this report now, and hopefully people are going to pay attention to it. And I know that CCM and other organizations are going to continue to push, obviously, legislators to make sure that this does get implemented. Although The report very brilliantly looks at areas where we can actually take some of that money and use it better. It does also, of course, state that yes, you are going to have to spend some money as well, and it's not cheap. And of course, these things never are because we're talking long term. We're not talking about short term fixes here. School policy reform, increasing school and educator capacity, and creating employment programs, three of the biggest drivers. I want to pick up on one particular one, which involves education. And you and Justin Elicker, the mayor of New Haven, recently were at a press conference about this. And it is one of the elements within the report. And it's called educational cost sharing. Explain to us a little bit about what that is and why that's so important to get resolved and make it more fair.
I think the first thing that's important about it is that people in Connecticut, I'm going to shift gears just slightly here, but people in Connecticut all know that, here we're a high tax state, but they all know that predominantly we're a high tax state because we're an exceptionally high property tax state. And so the reason why this line to action is important, there's a couple of reasons. We'll talk about the equity issue here in a second, but one of the very big reasons why it's important is the state has proportionately reduced its share of public education funding fairly consistently since 2017. And by proportion, it doesn't mean that they've budgeted less. It means that they haven't kept up with inflation. And so what happens is at one time, the state of Connecticut was covering about 45% of public education costs with a goal. There was a stated goal at one time of the state wanting to get to 50%. Under these last few years, that 45% share has decreased to under 36%. Now, that's not a cost control. It's not, well, maybe we need to control costs better in public education. It is a direct cost shift where the state has said, we're going to stop funding public education through the income tax, through the sales tax, use that money for different things that are our priorities. And we're going to tell the towns and cities, you make up the difference. That you make up the difference, just since 2017, is well over $400 million shift into the property tax. So when you hear the governor or state policymakers or others talk about how they haven't raised taxes, they've actually raised property taxes by over $400 million since 2017 through their policies. And it's important that people know that. Now, to be fair, or maybe unfair, however you want to put it, all of that money has not been picked up in the property tax. What's happened in some towns and cities that don't have the capacity to do it, they start cutting in other areas because they have to fund those education costs. So where do they cut? Well, maybe they cut in their police force, they cut in there. So now you have this equity issue with disconnected youth not getting the resources that they need in schools. In many cases, having them drop off the map and return to the streets. And then they go to the streets and we don't even have a law enforcement community to deal with them or address them anymore because we've had to cut because of those shifts. So I think that's part of this argument, is just making it clear that Connecticut is actually not a leader. Connecticut is really in the bottom quarter in the country of how much the state picks up on the proportional share of public education. So that's really important for people to get, that it's not about they haven't raised taxes. They have raised them. They just haven't raised the income tax or the sales tax. They've pushed them into the most regressive tax that we have, into the property tax. That's the first part. The second part of that is when you fund education so heavily through the property tax, you create immediate and massive equity issues. So communities that have the wealth to be able to handle that, they can send their children to a well-funded school. But if you go to a community that doesn't have that type of property wealth, now all of a sudden you have a massive equity issue. And what happens in that scenario, it's really crazy when you think about it. The children that have the highest needs maybe come from single family households or no family households, have food insecurity, have homelessness, maybe have other types of disabilities, special education, whatever the case may be. It's often the children with the highest needs that come from the areas where the least amount of money is spent. And it's the kids with the lowest needs. It's the kids like mine that have the resources at home, that have two parents, that have an area set up for them to do homework, that aren't worried about where their next meal is coming from. We spend the most amount of money on those kids. And it creates this massive disparity. So the 2 points there, number one, we should stop saying that we're not raising taxes when we're just pushing cost into the property taxes, and we now have the highest property taxes in the country. And number two, we should create just an identity as a state that says what, where a child is born should, in our state, should not determine what level of public education that they receive. And if we could come to those two honest assessments, I think we could move this forward much easier.
It's been 2 months since the report came out. It was October of this year. The focus has quite rightly shifted to what the report is called Young People First. What happens now?
I think the first thing to point out is we have a remarkable, broad, very diverse coalition of people who are behind this work. It is not often that you see the state's largest business association, the CBIA, the Connecticut Business and Industry Association, team up with the teachers' unions together on the same page of saying this has to be done. So if you look at just the aggressive statements of support and the willingness to actually step in and advocate and do events and educate the community, you have, again, the business community, you have education, you have the United Way, you have the State School Finance Project, you have all of these multiple nonprofits, the superintendents of schools, you have all of these very diverse entities that have all come out with very strong statements of support saying, this is right for Connecticut. This is right for our jobs. It's right for our future. It's not just a social issue of doing the right things for kids. The General Assembly has indicated this is a priority for them this session, not to do all of these things. There's no way you could implement all of this report in one session. And we recognize that, but to actually lean in and to start making the incremental steps and start getting the points on the board to accomplish what this plan is intended to accomplish over 10 years. And we're going to continue to push forward that way until we can get some things across the finish line.
Joe DeLong, Executive Director and CEO of the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. Thank you for giving us an update.
Thanks, Brian.
And if you haven't seen the report or want to read it, head over to the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities website at ccm-ct.org and click on the Young People First link. Connecticut East This Week is made possible by
SCAD, the Southeastern Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, is looking for licensed clinicians and is offering the top benefits packages in the state. Go to licensedclinicians.org to learn more. That's licensedclinicians.org.
The Connecticut Council on Problem Gambling is a nonprofit organization which, through advocacy, prevention, and education, is here to support individuals and families who are impacted by problem gambling. Our helpline, 1-888-789-7777, is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We also have live chat and tech support through our website, www.ccpg.org.
Time now for a look at other stories making the headlines this week. The Connecticut Audubon Society has released its annual State of the Birds report, calling for a review of the use of pesticides in the state. The society is looking for the state legislator to review the use of neonicotinoids, or neocids, that kill insects and bugs but then go on to kill birds who eat them. Tom Anderson is with the Connecticut Audubon Society and the editor of the report, and says the amount of birds that die every year in the nation is alarming.
Over the last 50 or so years, the number of birds in North America has declined by about 30%. There are literally 3 billion fewer birds in North America now than there were, say, in 1970. And there are 2 or 3 important causes, but among those is the use of pesticides.
Anderson also says one of the biggest users of these types of chemicals are landscaping businesses who use neocids to treat golf courses and people's lawns.
These things tend to be used in spring when there are insects around. And a robin, for example, that happens to be nesting near your lawn will drop down and pluck a caterpillar or a worm from the lawn and bring it back to its nest to feed its babies. It's therefore transporting the pesticide, the poison, from the ground into the mouths of its babies.
Anderson says people with lawn services should ask them whether they are using pesticides containing neocids and to use an alternative instead. He says they are not looking for an outright ban on the use of the chemical, but want the agricultural and landscaping industries who use them most to scale back and use safer alternatives, similar to New York and Vermont, who have enacted legislation on the use of neocid pesticides. Details about the State of the Birds report and pesticides can be found at the Society's website, ctaudubon.org. Connecticut and the nation are working on lowering methane emissions, which means taking a closer look at agriculture. Edwin J. Vieira from the Connecticut News Service has this report.
Connecticut has cut methane emissions from agriculture and landfill decomposition, but these still account for up to 25% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. Nationally, livestock production is a top source of these emissions. While solutions to mitigate methane exist, Fernanda Ferreira with the Clean Air Task Force says the lack of wider benefits make it harder for farmers to adopt these practices.
The very few solutions that we have available, it's not like they're going to adopt that solution. It's going to reduce emissions, plus it's going to improve animal welfare, plus it's going to reduce their costs or improve milk production or wool production or meat production.
How farmers store manure can impact how much methane it generates. Storing it in lagoons creates the ideal conditions for creating emissions. Other storage methods, like using it as fertilizer, are beneficial but create other environmental hazards like runoff. The Environmental Protection Agency awarded Connecticut conservation groups $10 million to handle issues like this in Long Island Sound in 2022. I'm Edwin J. Vieira.
One of Connecticut's most iconic lighthouses has undergone $250,000 of repair work to stop it from falling apart. Ledge Lighthouse sits at the mouth of the Thames River between New London and Groton and continues to be an aid to navigation for ships and vessels. Bruce Buckley is the president of the Ledge Light Foundation, whose volunteers helped to maintain the lighthouse, and said the unique way the lighthouse was built is now the cause of the problems they're facing today.
What's unusual about the lighthouse is it was designed using iron as the framing, which in 1909 was kind of cutting edge technology. There's a beam that runs the whole length above the windows, and it serves as a support on the second floor for the roof. And when we took the brick out, we realized that a good portion of that beam had been compromised, basically had rusted through.
Ownership of the lighthouse was transferred from the Coast Guard to the New London Maritime Society in 2014, and Buckley says it's all part of a government sell-off of the nation's lighthouses.
They want to divest themselves of as many of the lighthouses that make sense. There's some important ones around the country that they don't want to sell. The other ones, like Ledge Lighthouse, they can't afford to pay for the upkeep. They'd like to get some private or public organizations involved. So what they do is they solicit bids from nonprofits that would use the lighthouse as an educational platform, or one that they could just install a museum in and have people come out.
Buckley says money for future repairs and restoration is being sought from state bonding as well as a GoFundMe campaign, and says that figure will be at least $3 to $4 million. Anyone interested in donating can visit GoFundMe.com and search for Support Urgent Repairs for Ledge Lighthouse. And Jody Rell, a former Connecticut governor, was laid to rest recently. Rell died in November in Florida after a brief illness, aged just 78. Her body laid in state at the Capitol for visitors to view ahead of a public and also separate private family ceremony. Rell will be interned at the Connecticut State Veterans Cemetery alongside her husband, Lou Rell, who was a U.S. Navy veteran. She was remembered for her open-door policy of governing and also for bringing ethics back to state politics at a difficult time for Connecticut when her predecessor, Governor John Rowland, resigned amidst a corruption scandal. Rell was Connecticut's second female governor. That's all from us for this edition. Do send us your questions and story ideas to the show via our website at connecticut-east.com or Facebook or Twitter at Connecticut East and on Instagram at Connecticut East This Week. And you can listen to the show again on our social platforms, on demand, and by asking your smart speaker to play Connecticut East This Week podcast. And please like, follow, and share on your social media too. I'm Brian Scott Smith. Thank you for listening.